All right, hello to those who are just joining us. And just to let you know, we're gonna get started in about 5 minutes. So just hang on tight. Thanks so much for coming. All right, thanks for joining us tonight. We'll get started in about 4 minutes. So just hang on till then. Thanks so much. All right, everybody. It is 7 o'clock, and I think we should get started to reward the people who get here on time. So thank you once again for joining us. My name is Matt Binder. I am your new adult program coordinator. I was your program assistant, but now I have been promoted, and I can't be more happy to be providing you with great programs as Annie did before me. So thank you for coming. Tonight, we have a very distinguished guest. John Mark Hansen is the Charles L. Hutchinson Distinguished Service Professor in Political Science at the University of Chicago. His areas of expertise include electoral politics and voter participation. He is the author, with Stephen J. Rosenstone, of Mobilization, Participation, and Democracy in America, written in 1993, and other books and articles. In 2001, he was the coordinator of the Research Task Force on the Federal Election System for the National Commission on Federal Election Reform, an independent, bipartisan panel chaired by Presidents Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford. His reports were included as an appendix to the Commission's publication, To Assure Pride and Confidence in the Electoral Process, published in 2002. Just before we get started, I just want to ask, if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A box. That way we can get to them after the presentation is finished. All right, and without any more from me, I would like to introduce Mark Hansen.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for being interested in voting rights in the United States. I'm going to share my screen, so bear with me while I get that up and going. And here we go. So when I was contacted about this presentation, I was told that there were people in Schaumburg who were interested in voting rights in the United States, who were interested in learning a little bit more about kind of the history of the suffrage in the United States and learning a little bit more about what some of the current controversies are vis-a-vis voting rights in the United States. And so what I'm going to be giving you over about the next 35 minutes or so is a history of suffrage in the United States, going back to the founding, the implementation of the 1789 Constitution, and the first presidential and congressional elections in 1789. Then I will also finish up by talking about the, by talking about the remaining restrictions on the suffrage and the impediments to the exercise of the suffrage, and something about their effects as well. Where I want to start is where this notion of rights comes from. One of the things that's very interesting about it is the way in which it's tied up. This conception of individual rights is tied up with Enlightenment ideas that arose at the same time of the moral equality of persons. And so we have, of course, the famous words of Thomas Jefferson at the very beginning of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To get a sense of just how radical that statement was, what is really asserting in saying that all men are created equal is that everybody has a kind of equal moral right to the goods of society. That is, it doesn't matter whether you were born to royalty or born to the peasantry. It doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. It doesn't matter whether you're educated or not. Everybody is entitled to these rights as a matter of first principles. So the notion is that we're all children of God, and that God, in God's eyes, we're all equal to each other. These kind of earthly distinctions are not of interest to God, and they shouldn't be of interest to us in setting up our political system, our system of government. Fast forward a little bit, and we might ask, well, what does that have to do with the right to vote? And one of the most interesting things about the right to vote is that among all of the rights that are provided for us in our system of government, the right to vote is the one that is most closely reflective of that idea of the moral equality of people. That is, no matter whether you're highborn or lowborn, no matter whether you're educated or not educated, no matter whether you're rich or poor, no matter whether you live in a city or you live in the country, everybody gets one vote and only one vote. And so, as J. Rowan Pennock put it, the most important single argument for the equality of the vote is that it symbolizes the principle of presumptive equality, which is one of democracy's central values. So what's interesting about voting rights in the United States is exactly the way in which it links up to this idea of the moral equality of persons. In the other kinds of rights that we might talk about, the rights to speech, the rights to religion, and so on and so forth, there are perhaps differences in some of those cases in the degree to which people can actually exercise or benefit from those rights. But in the case of the vote, everyone has one and only one vote. So despite the notion that the right to vote is a kind of core or reflects values that are at the core of our democracy, the extension of voting rights in the United States was actually fairly slow to come. So if you look in the Constitution for a right to vote, you'll be reading for a long time before you find it. And that's because in the Bill of Rights, we usually think of as sort of cataloging the rights that people have in our governmental system. The right to vote is nowhere in those first 8 amendments, 9 and 10 being on rather different subjects. But in those first 8 amendments, free speech, freedom of religion, right to bear arms, all those sorts of things, there's no mention of voting rights. And in fact, the only mention that the original Constitution of 1789 says about who shall be able to vote is in Article 1, Section 2, which is describing elections to the United States House of Representatives, where it says that the electors, that is the voters, the people who are eligible to participate in elections for members of the House of Representatives, shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. That is, what it does is to establish a floor. That is, you cannot have fewer people eligible to vote for members of the House of Representatives than are eligible to vote for the numerous branches of the state legislature, usually the state assembly or the state House of Representatives. As you also see, the Constitution, the original Constitution, pretty much leaves the right to vote and the decision about who is entitled to vote or not up to the states. And that's still considerably the case, although things, in fact, did change over time. We, in fact, find the first mention of a right to vote in the 15th Amendment, passed in 1870 after the Civil War. And this was an amendment that was meant to guarantee the rights, particularly of African Americans, the newly freed slaves, to vote in American elections. So it reads, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. It was the 15th Amendment, together with some provisions in the 14th Amendment, which define national citizenship. Okay, it was those provisions that first established a national right to vote, a constitutional right to vote. So it comes fairly late, fourscore and 7 plus what, another 6 years? So fourscore and 11 years after the ratification of the United States Constitution. And so there have been various amendments since then that have extended the right to vote. The 19th Amendment in 1920, which reads almost exactly like the 15th Amendment, saying the right to vote shall not be abridged or denied on account of sex. And then finally, in the 26th Amendment, passed in 1971, that extended the right to vote in federal elections to people who are between the ages of 18 and 20 years old. So the notion of a right to vote, despite its kind of normative importance to the whole enterprise of democracy, the notion of a right to vote was fairly slow to take hold in the American Republic. And in fact, in the early days of the Republic, the franchise was quite restricted. That is, there were relatively few people in the electorate, relatively few people who could, in fact, vote in elections, either at the federal or at the state or at the local level. As you can see here, in those early years from 1790 to 1830, the number of states that had some kind of economic requirement for the franchise was about half of the states. So the bold horizontal lines here are the actual number of states at the time. And then there are two kinds of economic restrictions that were placed on the exercise of the franchise in the colonial and early federal periods. Those were property qualifications. You had to be an owner of real property, or you had to be a taxpayer. So some of these were separate provisions. Many states had both as provisions. As you can see, by the time we get into the 1820s and 1830s, though, the use of these economic restrictions on voting were going down and down and down and down. And there was a particular reason for that. It has to do with westward expansion. It will turn out actually in our story today that westward expansion ends up having a liberalizing effect on voting rights in the United States. And this is the first instance of that. That is, as the United States moved westward, as new states were admitted to the Union, they generally had more liberal franchise restrictions or more liberal franchise qualifications than the states in the original 13. So as you can see here, the number of states that were most liberal on the left-hand side in 1800, there were only 3 states that had no property qualifications or no tax-paying qualifications for exercising the vote. That was New Hampshire, Vermont, and Kentucky. But by the 1830s, when a whole bunch of states west of the Appalachian Mountains had been admitted to the Union, the states were predominantly states that have relatively few restrictions, that had those sort of yellow, shading that indicates no qualifications, or the light green shading that indicates tax-paying qualifications, which were easier to meet in general than property holding qualifications. And there's a reason for this. So as these new states came into the Union, they decided to have more liberal access to the vote than the states that were in the Union for a longer period of time relative to the original 13 states. And there was a good reason for that. The reason for that was that these states were eager to encourage settlement. And one way to encourage settlement was by giving people more say in the government in those states west of the Appalachians. And so these new states that came in tended to have more liberal franchise laws than the older states. And the pressure of having more liberal franchise laws, what that meant was that there were more people who were qualified to vote, which meant that there were more votes that were expressed in those states, which meant in presidential elections, at least, that there were more votes coming from the Western states. And that in turn helped to put pressure on some of the states in the East to liberalize their voting laws as well. So the great result of the extension of the franchise in the 18 teens into the 1830s was the election of Andrew Jackson to the presidency in 1828. Jackson was the first president who lived west of the Appalachians who was elected president. He was from Tennessee. And he was viewed as kind of the representative of the Western common man, the mechanics and the farmers and the small business owners that you found west of the Appalachian Mountains. And so this kind of populist turn, this kind of popular government turn is really something that happens 2 or 3 decades into the Federal Republic. By the 1820s, by the late 1820s, at the time that Jackson is elected, the United States has what is referred to as universal white manhood suffrage. Yes, there were still restrictions on the suffrage. Slaves, African Americans in general, could not vote. And moreover, women could not vote. The franchise was restricted to men. But the United States was the first nation in the world to attain some semblance of universal suffrage. With those qualifications, universal white manhood suffrage came earlier in the United States than it did in any other polity, certainly sooner than it did in any other country that was not a democracy, but even relative to other countries that were democracies. Another way in which we can kind of gauge the kind of the democratization of voting rights is in this particular figure. This shows the selection of presidential electors by popular vote. So the red and pink here are the states that did not have popular elections for president. So the electors were basically appointed by the state legislatures. And the blue represents the states where there was a presidential election, which effectively was electing the electors who would then elect the president. And as you can see, there were quite a few states into the early 19th century that did not have popular elections for president. But by 1828, in the election of Andrew Jackson, we only have one state that is still holding out. Every other state is having popular elections for presidential electors. And that one holdout in 1828 was South Carolina, and it was a holdout up until the Civil War, up until 1860, which, for those of you who know something about the political history of South Carolina, it makes a certain kind of sense. It would be South Carolina that would be the holdout. So that was the kind of the great innovation in the United States, was the extension of the franchise, particularly the repeal of these economic restrictions on the franchise. And the effect of that was the greatest expansion of voter participation in the nation's history. So as you can see, in 1789, the very first presidential and congressional elections in 1789, only about 10–12% of the electorate was eligible to vote, or of the population, the male white population was eligible to vote in those elections. And there's a fairly steady increase in that suffrage percentage up until the 1850s, late 40s, 1850s, when the issue of slavery and the extension of slavery become an extremely important mobilizing force in American politics. There's a steady increase in the franchise, and that basically has to do with the repeal of these property owning restrictions. As I've indicated, however, these restrictions that were based on property and based on tax paying were not the only restrictions on the franchise in the early republic. And in fact, restrictions that were based on race not only were common early in the history of the Federal Republic, but they also increased over time. So as new states came into the Union, they tended to adopt new restrictions that restricted the franchise effectively to white men. For instance, one of these laws was the so-called Logan Law in Illinois, which was passed, I believe, in the 1840s or maybe early 1850s. It was part of the so-called black laws in Illinois, which were basically designed to keep African Americans out of Illinois, where slavery was not allowed in Illinois, but even freemen were not welcome in the state of Illinois. And the consequence of that as well was that it was very, very difficult for African Americans to gain the franchise in Illinois. And that persisted until the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. The state legislature did ultimately repeal those laws, but they repealed those laws after, in fact, the 15th Amendment had been ratified in 1870. So these racial restrictions on voting, though, were, of course, repealed by the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment was submitted to the states by a vote of the United States Congress in February of 1869 and declared ratified a year later in February of 1870. And as you can see, it's a fairly simple statement. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This was a key element in the reconstruction of the South after the Civil War. As you well know, many of the states of the South were at that time dominated by the Republican Party. The Republican Party essentially being made up by African-American freedmen and a few freemen, and by Northerners who had come south, and by liberal Southerners. That, of course, led to a backlash in the South, and ultimately the Reconstruction project failed, at least in the short run. So after Reconstruction, by the 1870s, General Grant serves 2 terms as president from 1868 to 1872 and from 1872 to 1876. As you may know, there was a closely contested election in 1876 where Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, the race went down to the wire in 2 states, Florida and Louisiana, where the election results were disputed because of election violence, because of election fraud, and so on and so forth. And ultimately what came out of that was an agreement by the Hayes administration to withdraw United States troops from the South for the first time since they occupied the South after the Civil War, and basically to pull back on enforcement of federal laws in the South. And so kind of allowing the white supremacists in the South to begin to take control again in Southern politics. That was a period that was known as reaction in the North and a period known as redemption in the South. But it was a reflection both of the way in which the northern states and the Republicans were getting tired of having to sort of constantly deal with these issues in the South, and of course the desires of Southerners to reimpose a racial ordering. And that was true in voting rights as well. So these are the 11 states that seceded from the Union in 1861. Their dates of readmission, beginning with Tennessee in 1866, and extending to Georgia, which was readmitted to the Union after previously being admitted and then kicked out again, and then readmitted in July 1870. Redemption was the election of a governor from the conservative white Democratic faction. So the sort of the reinstantiation of white supremacist government in the South, and following these redemption governments and the readmission of Southern states to the Union, were quite a number of states that adopted restrictions on Black suffrage, first by statutory means, beginning in 1871 in Georgia, and later as well by constitutional means, beginning in 1890 in Mississippi. So these were known collectively as Jim Crow electoral laws, and they were designed in various ways to keep African Americans from being able to exercise the franchise. They didn't, as you'll see, they didn't only exclude African Americans. And in fact, there were many poor whites who also were restricted from voting by the Jim Crow election laws, but they were meant specifically to keep African Americans out of the electorate. And these included literacy tests, which were adopted by 23 states, including many northern states. There were several states in the South, though, that allowed people to be exempted from the literacy test if they held property or paid taxes. And then there were the infamous grandfather clauses in 4 southern states, where if your grandfather was a legal voter, then you could also be a legal voter, regardless of whether you could pass the literacy test or not. A second aspect of this is poll taxes. So most of the southern states impose poll taxes. Poll here is not a voting tax, rather it's a head tax. It's like a polled steer. Polled steers are ones that have had their horns removed. So poll taxes are basically head taxes, and the head taxes were required in order to exercise the franchise. Until you paid your poll tax, you could not in fact cast a ballot. And some states made it even harder by making the poll tax cumulative. So you couldn't just sort of come in every second year and pay your poll tax. If you had not paid your poll tax for 2 years, you had to pay both years of your poll tax in order to vote in that election. And so it became a major impediment to poor people to vote. Likewise, voter registration was also part of the Jim Crow electoral regime in the South. And we'll talk a little bit more about voter registration in just a moment. And then finally, there was the device of the white primary. Here, the notion was the political parties were in fact not parts of government, so they weren't actually subject to the Constitution. that they were private clubs, and that private clubs could perfectly well decide who was qualified for membership and who not. And so there were a number of states in the South that adopted the white primary. That is, they enabled only whites to vote in the Democratic primary, did not allow blacks to vote in the Democratic primary. And since by that time, Democrats dominated elections in the South, being nominated by the Democratic Party was tantamount to being elected. The effect of the poll tax and literacy tests were dramatic. And so this is from a very nice study in the early 70s. As you can see here, this is looking at the 11 Southern states and looking at elections from 1892 to 1916. Voter turnout in states that had neither a literacy test nor a poll tax averaged 72% in that time period. That's the upper left-hand part of this table. On the other hand, voter turnout in states that had both a poll tax and a literacy test was only 24%. That is, there is a threefold difference, threefold difference between voter turnout in states that were relatively permissive in access to the franchise, that did not require a poll tax or a literacy test, versus states that required one or the other, and especially relative to states that required both. At the same time as the Southern states were implementing the Jim Crow electoral laws, all the states in the Union were beginning to implement voter registration. And so these are some very nice figures that come from an article, recent article. And these show the percentage of the electorate that had to register to vote in all of these different states. So we have Connecticut, Delaware, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana across the top frame. And then we have 4 states that had statewide voter registration by the year 1880. The reason why everybody did not have to register to vote in this early period of voting registration was that many states imposed this requirement only on large cities or on larger towns. And so in Illinois, you can see basically right here that this is basically the increasing population of the city of Chicago, which was effectively the only city that was required to have voter registration by the state of Illinois. So the states, both in the South and outside the South, implemented voter registration. The ostensible reason for implementing voter registration was to prevent fraud. And in fact, there was considerable fraud. But in sort of thinking about the way these things were created, it was very clear that the target of voter registration in the South was not fraud by any old people, but rather fraud by African Americans, or fraud involving African Americans, or just a convenient way to keep African Americans from voting. And in the North, where the restrictions once again were on cities and not on small towns and rural areas, this was an area, or this was a time of very, very high immigration. And so this was clearly targeted at cities with large immigrant populations, and oftentimes large immigrant populations from not just from Northern and Western Europe, but from Southern and Eastern Europe as well. So the combined effect of the Jim Crow election laws and voter registration was a spectacular decline in the involvement of Americans in their elections, from about 80% voter turnout in presidential elections in the 1860s to between 50 and 60% in the late during the 1920s. And so these restrictions had important effects. So one way to sort of think about the evolution of voting rights in the United States is that things started out with a liberalization. There was a reaction and a conservative backlash and a restriction of voting rights in the period from the Civil War up until the 1930s. There were other aspects, though, of liberalization. And the most important of these was the passage of the 19th Amendment, submitted to the states by the United States Congress in June of 1919 and ratified in August of 1920, just in time for the 1920 presidential election. This, of course, was the amendment that extended to women the right to vote. And as you can see, the text of the 19th Amendment is virtually the same as the text of the 15th Amendment. And in fact, it was explicitly modeled on the 15th Amendment. So there's a good reason for that. So how did this movement, during an otherwise fairly conservative period when there was greater restrictiveness in access to the vote, why this extension of the vote to women? Well, once again, our story has to do with westward expansion. The first states to adopt women's suffrage were primarily what were called Western states, which was everything west of the Mississippi River. The first state, actually territory, to provide full suffrage to women was Wyoming in 1869. And then followed by by another territory, actually Utah Territory in 1870. And as you can see, there were several other states that had partial women's suffrage, which is mostly allowing women to vote in local elections, but not in state elections. By 1900, the number of states that had enacted some kind of women's suffrage were much greater, but again, a predominance of Western states. The first state to adopt voter registration was Colorado in 1893. Excuse me, to adopt women's suffrage was Colorado in 1893, and of course, I think by 1890, I think 1890 was the year that Utah came into the Union. So it would have been and 1889 was the year that Wyoming came into the Union. So there were states that came into the Union, but Colorado was the first to adopt women's suffrage as a state. And by 1915, on the eve of the submission of the 19th Amendment, every state west of the Rocky Mountains had adopted full women's suffrage, and every state west of the Appalachian Mountains, or almost every state west of the Appalachian Mountains, had adopted some form of women's suffrage, which in some sense made women's suffrage kind of an anticlimax. It had already been accomplished in the states by the time it was ratified for federal elections. So again, we see greater liberalization in the Western states. And why is that? Well, one good reason is because, like the trans-Appalachian states in the early part of the 19th century, the trans-Rocky Mountain states in the late 19th century were also eager for people to settle. And so one of the ways that they tried to get people to come, and especially women to come, was by extending greater rights to women. So as you can see here, in 1870, the United States had these are called population pyramids. The red here are the number of women, and the left and the blue here are the number of men, and by age group. And so in a growing population, a normal population pyramid actually looks like a pyramid, like the United States in the 1870s. But as you can see, in Wyoming in 1870, California in 1870, and Nevada in 1870, this doesn't look anything like a normal population pyramid. There are almost no women in places like Wyoming and in Nevada. And so, these states were eager to have women come in, to marry, to establish families, to kind of create a kind of normal society that was different from the societies of miners and lumberjacks and other early settlers, primarily young men, single young men. So again, we sort of see that Western expansion had this kind of liberalizing effect on the franchise. So that takes us up effectively to the Great Depression. And as all of you know, there was a period again of liberalization of voting rights that began with World War II in many respects, but really took hold with the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The Voting Rights Act had a number of important provisions. One was a ban on discriminatory voting requirements and procedures. So, for instance, it did not ban, but froze the application of the poll tax until the passage of an amendment that, in fact, abolished it. It also introduced this idea of covered jurisdictions. So, covered jurisdictions, as defined by the bill, were jurisdictions that had a history of discriminatory election practices, and they were primarily in the South, but not entirely in the South. As you'll see in a moment, there were also states and counties in the West, in New Mexico and Arizona, in particular, in places like South Dakota, in Alaska, where the restrictions on voting rights had not affected African Americans, but had affected, in particular, Native Americans. And so they were brought under the provisions of the Voting Rights Act as well. And for these covered jurisdictions, the Voting Rights Act required that jurisdictions that were covered by the act, that had a history of these discriminatory practices, had to pre-clear any changes in their election laws with the Justice Department before implementing them. That is, they couldn't just change the law. They had to ask permission from the federal government, and the federal government, the Justice Department, would basically see whether they qualified as racially neutral under the terms of the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act also gave the federal government the right to send examiners into southern jurisdictions that were covered under the Voting Rights Act. And that was oftentimes under the threat that they could simply take over voter registration. So as you can imagine, the states kind of got that message pretty quickly, and things changed pretty quickly. There were subsequent renewals and amendments to the Voting Rights Act, most recently in 2006, the most important of which in the 1970s required election materials to be made available to language minorities. As you can see, the implementation of Jim Crow election laws this is in Louisiana, which is the dotted line, where they actually had voter registration by race, and so you can tell these things. So the implementation of the Jim Crow election laws took voter registration among African Americans from 100% down to about 2% in the space of just a single decade. But then the Voting Rights Act had the effect of basically evening the playing field again. So here's the 1965 Voting Rights Act. As you can see, African Americans in the South and in Louisiana are registering to vote in greater numbers, even in the late 1950s. Again, kind of under the threat that the feds might step in. And then after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, that is extended even further. And so the result of that then is the current system that we have. The low point of voter turnout after the extension, after universal white mandated suffrage was in this period in the 19-teens and 1920s, this kind of trough right before the New Deal. And since then, we've held steady at around, or we've varied a fair bit, but from the low 50s to the low 60s% in presidential years, and from the low 40s up into the high 40s during midterm election years. So let me turn now then to remaining franchise restrictions. So there was enormous liberalization of the franchise. Just think about it. So going from a system where only property owners or only taxpayers were qualified to vote to where any white man was qualified to vote was an enormous change, right? The extension of suffrage to women was an enormous change. It doubled the size of the electorate overnight. And the extension of voting rights to African Americans in the period after the Civil War, and then the ratification or the actual enforcement of those voting rights after the Voting Rights Act in 1965, the overall trend of American politics has been to liberalize voting rights. There are still continuing franchise restrictions. Citizens under 18 are not allowed to vote in federal elections, although there are some jurisdictions that allow teens as young as 16 to vote in local elections. There are still a number of states, and I'll show you more data on this in a moment, who disqualify felons for some period of time from exercising the franchise. All the states currently restrict non-citizens from voting. That has not always been the case. In the 1920s, in fact, there were a number of states that allowed residents who had applied to naturalize to vote while they were still in the process of being naturalized. So there have been periods in the past when non-citizens have legally voted in the United States. And then finally, there have been a whole bunch of restrictions having to do with or changes in a whole bunch of aspects of voter registration. Changes in the closing date for registration, that is how far in advance of the election you have to register to vote. The adoption of same-day registration, registration by mail, registration applications that are started when you apply for a driver's license or some other government benefit, and then automatic voter registration, where you basically are registered to vote. If you sign up for any sort of government service, you're registered to vote unless you say that you don't want to be registered to vote. There have also been restrictions on purges of voter rolls, that is how quickly you can remove people from voter rolls for not voting. And then finally, the adoption, particularly in the early decades of this century, of provisional ballots, so that people who do not show up on registration rolls, but who may in fact be eligible to vote, can still cast a vote, and their eligibility can be determined at a later time. Registration closing dates have gotten shorter and shorter and shorter. As you can see, the most restrictive states are still in the South, with closing dates that are 4 weeks or more in advance of the election. And then there are a number of states that have liberalized, and especially northern states. The asterisks here designate states that have election day registration. You can actually go in, register to vote, and cast a vote right there that first day. The importance of voter registration is that different populations have different either propensity or different resources necessary to register to vote. And so this shows simply registration by ethnicity. As you can see, whites are more likely to be registered to vote than Blacks, Asians, or Hispanics. Asians and Hispanics, many of them cannot register to vote because they are not citizens yet. And so that's why the percentage who are registered of the population of Asians and Hispanics is less than 50%. But as you can see, even among African Americans, Asians, and Hispanics who are citizens, voter registration is lower than voter registration among whites. And so there are real racial differences. There are differences in age. Young people are less likely to be registered than older people. There are differences in terms of residence in cities and rural areas and so on. A second current restriction is felony disfranchisement. As you can see, there are only 2 states that do not strip you of your voting rights when you are convicted of a felony, and that is Vermont and Maine. The states here are ordered on the key on the right-hand side. They're ordered from the most restrictive to the least restrictive policies on regaining the franchise. So there are 2 states, Virginia and Kentucky, that will never allow you to vote if you've ever been convicted of a felony. There are other states, particularly in the Midwest and the South, that require you to petition to the governor, oftentimes, for restoration of voting rights, and many states that do not allow prisoners to vote or do not allow people who are under sentence to vote, but allow them to vote once they have discharged that sentence. And then finally, there are a number of procedural impediments to the exercise of the franchise. And these I want to just sort of go through very quickly so we have time for a few questions. One is polling place accessibility. So it turns out that if you're African American, you're going to wait longer to vote than if you're white. And if you're Hispanic, you're going to wait longer to vote than if you're white. Likewise, if you live in a city, you're going to wait longer to vote than if you live in a rural area. And suburbs are more like cities in that respect. Younger people also tend to live in places where they have to wait longer in line to vote, and so on and so forth. And part of the reason for that is simply that there are more people in these areas, but part of it is that some states have, shall we say, made it easier, have decided to make the availability of places to vote easier for some kinds of populations than for others. And that is one of the things that is at issue right now in some of the voting rules changes that have been going on in the states since the election of Barack Obama in 2008. A second procedural impairment is requirements that voters show identification, not just to register to vote, that's pretty common, but that they show identification at the polls. A third procedural impediment has to do when election day occurs. And so as we'll see in a moment, early voting has become more and more popular. The greater and greater percentage of the vote that is cast before election day at a time when it might be more convenient for people to vote than actually on election day. And then finally, liberalization of by mail and absentee voting. So as I indicated before, whites tend to have shorter wait times for in-person voting than Blacks and Hispanics do. And likewise, as I indicated, people in urban areas and suburban areas tend to have longer wait times than people in rural areas, and so on and so forth. So the simple fact of where the polling place is located, how far away it is, how many people staff it, that is how many people you can kind of get through in an hour, whether it's been moved or not. There's been research on this too. If a polling place is moved from one place to another, turnout goes down in that precinct because people don't remember that it's been moved and they go to the wrong place. So all of these little small things end up adding up. Here is a summary of voter identification requirements in the different states, ranging from the most onerous requirements, those that require a photo ID of certain kinds in the dark green states, to states that do not require you to document your identity in order to vote. One of those states that does not require you to document your identity is the state of Illinois, where, as you'll remember, you are asked to sign your ballot, and that signature is checked more or less against the signature that you gave at the time you registered, but you're not asked to show ID or to otherwise prove that you are who you claim to be. This also has effects that are disparate across different kinds of people. So this again is sort of looking at race and ethnicity. And what we see here is that whites are more likely to have what's called confirmed ID. So the IDs that meet the requirements of state election officials that require, in states that require identification, whites are more likely to have that identification than Blacks or Hispanics. As I've indicated, there has been a steady advance of provisions for early and absentee voting. And this is simply a summary of that. Very few states, and none west of Missouri, do not allow, under normal circumstances, either early voting or no excuse absentee voting. And so, many of those northeastern states and then states in the lower South are that way. But it has been spreading over time. And in 2020, it was liberalized in almost every state in the country. Only Indiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas did not make ballots available by mail, either by applying for an absentee ballot or by mailing mail ballots in the states that have vote by mail, like Oregon and Washington, and so forth. And so, in 2020, we saw it was easier than ever before to vote in elections in 2020 because of the steps that states made to avoid November 3rd from becoming a super spreader COVID event. The result of all of this is that the number of ballots that are cast before Election Day has been increasing steadily. Up until 2016, there were still a majority who voted in person on Election Day. But as you can see in 2020, between those who voted early in person and those who voted by mail, that was many more than the people who actually voted on election day this year. And so that's another thing that these state legislatures are monkeying around with right now. And then finally, another thing that has changed voting rights politics in a significant way is a Supreme Court decision from 2013 called Shelby County, Alabama versus Holder. Holder being Eric Holder, the Attorney General under Barack Obama. As I mentioned, there were, in the Voting Rights Act, there were defined numerous covered jurisdictions. And in those covered jurisdictions, you had to pre-clear any election law changes with the Justice Department before you could implement them. And as you can see, those Section 5 covered jurisdictions were primarily the Deep South states, plus most of Virginia, not all of Virginia, but most of Virginia, plus a good number of counties in North Carolina, plus a smattering of other jurisdictions, Arizona and Alaska with their Native American populations and so forth. And it was the provisions of Section 5 that were specifically ruled unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder. And so in that respect, we've seen something of a retreat. This was a very, very powerful tool for preventing states that had a history of racial discrimination in their voting practices. It sort of opened up the entire playing field again. There were numerous states that after 2013 took advantage of the decision in Shelby County in order to make more restrictive voting laws and to cut back on access to the ballot. So I'm going to finish there, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions.
All right, thanks, Mark. That was great. We have one question, and if you have any questions, put them in the chat or put them in the Q&A box. Our first question is from Sue. She asks, on the chart for early voter registration, West Virginia had a huge spike and then a rapid fall in the numbers. What caused this? It appeared that the other states rose and either continued to rise or stay flat.
Yes, you're right. I haven't looked that closely at it, but what it appears, let me find that. Here we are. Yeah, so this is West Virginia down here, which basically didn't have any voter registration until 1908 for the 1908 election, where it appears what happened was the state legislature adopted statewide voter registration in 1908 and then repealed it in 1912. And I don't know exactly why, but that appears to be the case. Notice as well that Wisconsin, oddly enough, actually had voter registration for a while, and from 1900 to 1908, and then likewise repealed it for a time. But by and large, once these once voter registration got going, they did tend to be extended finally to be statewide. Illinois, of course, has statewide voter registration, and I think you probably could not get away with a voter registration that applied only to jurisdictions of a certain size anymore.
Gail wants to make a clarification. She says, one clarification, you can be asked to show ID if your signatures don't match when you sign your ballot.
That could be, I've never had that problem before, but what I know from a fair number of election lawyers is the states are pretty forgiving on checking signatures. Not just because of being nice or anything like that, but because in fact, people's signatures change over time. If you think back at what your signature looked like when you were 22 years old, and if you're 62 like I am now, it is probably quite a bit different from what it was then. So the registration, there are good reasons why the registration signature and the signature on the ballot may not match. The other is that I'm usually holding the clipboard with one arm and trying to sign it with the other. So.
Actually, that happened to me. I live in DuPage County,
Is that right?
and my signature did not match. And when I pointed out to the two poll workers who asked for my ID, I said, "You're asking me to match a signature I signed in pen with one I'm signing on an iPad with a stylus. It's not going to look the same." They did not believe me, and that's fine. I still got to vote.
Yeah.
All right. I don't see any other questions. So, Mark, I'd love to thank you for your time. This was a very informative and well-researched presentation. We expected no less. Oh, I'm sorry. One more. Mac wants to ask. In the Shelby case, the aftermath of that ruling demonstrates the importance of pre-clearance. Will the Justice Department be going back to the court?
Well, the Justice Department can't use Section 5 to challenge election law changes anymore. The Supreme Court has said no. Now, Congress could change that law. Congress could adopt a new Voting Rights Act and basically define, one thing it could do is to define the entire country as a covered jurisdiction, not make any distinction between this places where this has been a problem and where it's not been a problem. That would be one way around it. And the other would simply be to kind of look at the opinion by Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, and his basic point was that it looks a lot like 1965, that the covered jurisdictions in 2006 look an awful lot like they did in 1965, and things have changed. To which Justice Ginsburg replied, "That's a little like saying that I don't need to take an umbrella because it's no longer raining." So at any rate, Section 5 is out until Congress changes the law for now. The Justice Department did announce just a few days ago that it is going to go to court to challenge the changes in the election laws in Georgia that were just implemented, but that's under Section 2 of the Act. And Section 2 of the Act is basically a section that requires the Justice Department to show that the intent was to discriminate against protected racial minorities, and in particular African Americans. It's a much higher bar, right? I mean, with preclearance, you don't have to prove anything. The proof was that Congress said that here were states that had a history of doing this funny business, and so any changes are prima facie suspect, versus what the Justice Department is going to have to prove in order to prove to a court's satisfaction that those Georgia provisions ought to be overruled as unconstitutional, or as contrary to the Voting Rights Act.
One more question from Carol. Carol asks, do all 50 states use voting machines exclusively?
Well, it depends on what you mean by voting machines. So the big controversy, as you'll remember, one of the big election reform controversies in the aftermath of the 2000 election, which gave rise to the Election Reform Commission that I helped to staff in 2001. One of the big problems there was electoral technology. And so those of you who remember the 2000 election will remember the people in Palm Beach County who mistakenly voted for Pat Buchanan, thinking they were voting for Gore because of the butterfly ballot. That was one kind of design problem. Another problem was that Florida and a number of other states used the vote-o-matic punch cards, where you took a stylus and you punched out a little square thing called a chad. And all these election officials in Florida basically trying to determine whether this chad that was attached by 3 corners but not by the 4th was a legal vote, or whether that one that was dimpled but all the corners are intact was a legal vote, all that sort of stuff, right? So we had those big things. So out of that came something called the Help America Vote Act. Out of the election reform effort came the Help America Vote Act. And a big part of that was helping states to upgrade their voter technology. The result of that is that states almost universally use some kind of mechanical recording device. So the voting machines are properly speaking, voting machines are the mechanical machines where you pull a lever and it records a vote. And those are used in places like New York and Connecticut. I voted on them when I was in Connecticut. Then there are the optical scan machines, and you've probably seen some of those yourself, where you either fill in a circle with a pencil, or you complete a line with a pencil or a marker or something like that, or you complete an arrow with a pencil or a marker. And that's a second kind of mechanical device where then those ballots are run through a reader that records the votes. And then a third kind are what are called direct recording electronic, DREs, like the Diebold machines that we've heard quite a lot about, where you're actually punching an electronic keypad that looks like an ATM keypad. So most states use those. The big security change that has been implemented since the earlier times is that states have also become more careful about choosing election technologies that have some kind of ability to be audited. And so, all of these, and some of these, like the optical scan, those can be audited because you have the paper ballots, right? So you can go back and you can count those paper ballots by hand. For the direct recording electronic, those were the ones where there was particularly a security risk. And so in Cook County, at least, some of the machines basically print out for you what your vote choices were for each office, right? And you're asked to review those and to make sure that those are correct. And then you punch a button that says, yes, those are correct. And that's, and basically that paper record that is printed out is going to be kept in case there needs to be a hand recount. So yes, there is some kind of mechanical intervention in almost every voting system now. There are very, very few jurisdictions that still use paper ballots.
All right. Well, Mark, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your presentation and your knowledge. And thank you at home for joining us once again. We will see you next time. Thanks so much, everybody. Good night.
Thank you.